Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this talk. I'm Seb, this is Oliver. You're in this room to learn about feature flag and how to control your deployment of new feature, how you can experiment with new feature. If it is not the talk you were expecting, you still can leave and go to another room. There are tons of sessions. I hope you enjoyed the conference so far. We designed this talk to have a minimum amount of slides, so I will talk for like 15 or 20 minutes, and then I will hand over to Olivier that will do a very long demo of 2 AWS services up until the end. So it's like 30% slides, and the rest is code, hands-on in the console, and a lot of talk. If we have time at the end, I'm going to open up questions, otherwise we'll stay there and we can take your questions offline one-to-one. The most frequently question we receive about this talk, because we did it already this week, is where can I get a hat like that? And you can get that at Venetians. It's at the CloudQuest launch. CloudQuest, it's a game from training and certification that allows you to learn about AWS services. So if you're going back to the Venetian at the CloudQuest launch, you can check if they still have hats like that. So you know life, it's a balance. You have to trade, to make trade-off. You have to trade for speed or for agility. And as a developer, we all write code and we want our code to be published, to test the code first and then to deploy it. Because code is only happy when it reaches production. This is where your investment pays off and your code is reaching to your customer and it can make a difference in your app. It can provide a better experience, better than your competitor, or a good customer experience in general. But some organizations are super cautious about the way they deploy the code. It remembers me a story when I was much younger, 20 years ago. I was working as a consultant in a large bank in a very small country in the middle of Europe with tons of banks. And that bank was so cautious about breaking something, that SLA with their customer, other banks, that they don't deploy very frequently. And actually, they deployed twice per year. So as a developer, you had a train of deployment, a window of deployment twice per year. If you miss that deployment window, your code will land into production 6 months later. How dynamic it is, how agile it is. It was a big weekend, everybody was bringing, they made huge backup, split the disk mirror, start to update all the systems, do all the change, operating level, system level, database, application level, and then they cross the fingers and they hope that at the end of the weekend they can restart the system and that everything goes well. That was super controlled, but it's not very agile. So the challenge is how can you be more agile, of course. Fast forward, we are in 2022, 21st century now. We have CI/CDs, continuous integration. Every time you git commit something, there is a build. Your unit tests are run automatically. Maybe some of you are deploying to production automatically as well. At Amazon, we do that with thousands of deployment into production every single day. Thousands for Amazon.com, for AWS. There's continuous pipeline delivering new code into production. But sometimes I'm working on a feature and I don't want to expose that feature to all my customers in one shot. For example, I used to work in the Alexa team, and when we launch a new language for Alexa, the feature is there in production since months before the general audience can actually access the new language. We are not deploying overnight and then launching a press release saying, hey, no, you can speak to Alexa in French, Italian, or Spanish, for example. The feature is already there, and we give access to that feature to a very subset of our customers so that they can test the feature, we can collect feedback, we can work with developers to work on skills. So how can we decouple functionality from a deployment? And that's the subject of this talk. Deploying is not equal to releasing. You release when you are ready, in technical terms. You release when marketing wants to release, when the press release is out, when there is a conference like today, we release the code. But of course, the code hits production weeks, sometimes months before the release. So this is not new, decoupling functionalities and release from deployment. It has been described many different ways. One way I really like is that blog from Martin Fowler. Martin Fowler, maybe you remember from the late At the end of last century, the great book Design Patterns, it was one of the four writers of that book. He has a very good blog about architecture, design patterns, software industry in general. And there is that blog about feature toggle, which is an alternate name for the same things, feature flags, about the theory, why, how, what are the options. So it's not oriented towards a specific product, it's more about the concept. You might use feature flag for many different reasons. In this talk, I'm going to feature about one specific use case, a release. I want to release a new feature. We are going to use a web app as a demo, and we are going to release a new feature into our web app. But you might use the same techniques for multiple different types of use cases. Experiments, for example. I want to deploy 2 variations of the same feature into production. Typical use case, a retail website. At AWS, we love to give example about retail websites. I don't know why. And you have different colors of the buy button, or a bigger button and a smaller button. And then you experiment how much customers are buying if the button is different. It's located at a different place on the page. It's bigger. It's a different color. Is it one version bringing more revenue than the other version? So that's how you can experiment. It's the same idea. You have 2 different features, and you measure the effectiveness of your feature before taking a decision. Launch control is very similar to release. Launch control is what we are doing here this week at reInvent. All the services that you are discovering this week that are new, they've been deployed many weeks in advance, sometimes months in advance, but we make them visible for you in the console the day Werner is on stage saying, hey, we're pleased to announce that new feature, that new capability. We just turn on a feature flag or turn off a feature flag. Operation people, they might increase the verbosity of the logging. Security people can change permission using a feature flag. Canary testing is a good example as well. Canary testing is to release a new feature to a very small subset of your population and to see how the feature behaves or your customer behave when that feature is there. Do you know why we call that canary testing? It's coming back from the ancient times of the mines, the coal mine, where you can get some very dangerous gas in the mine that can kill people. So at the time they were bringing small birds, canary, in a cage. And if something happens to the bird, because there is too much gas, the bird cannot breathe anymore, and something happens to the bird, it was a signal for the miners to leave out the mine and to go back to the surface. That's why we call that canary testing.
Nice story.
So that's the app we are going to show as an example. We try to keep it as minimum as possible to really focus the code on the feature toggle, on the feature flag. So there is no fancy HTML. It's not a full-fledged retail website full of complexity, complex framework. We try to really focus just on the code that we want to demonstrate. Another reason why it's so simple is because I did it, and that's pretty much the best I can do in terms of HTML design, and thanks to a couple of libraries like Bootstrap, for example. So the app, it's a guestbook application where a customer can leave messages, and you see it's read-only. There is no way there for a customer to add message. Currently, they need to send an email. It has to be approved, and then we update the web page. And of course, the product manager asked us to make it more dynamic, so we would like to have a form there where a customer can enter a new message. But we are a bit afraid that this form might increase the latency for the page to load or scare customer away from the page, or I don't know what bad can happen with such a complex new feature that we are going to add to the web page. So we are going to hide that form behind a feature flag and progressively release the feature flag to the group of customer. So that's the new version. When the feature flag will be on, that's the dynamic version, the editable version of the page versus the read-only version of the page. So hiding feature behind feature flag and doing experiments like A/B testing, that's something we are doing at Amazon since more than 25 years. Actually, in 1997, so really 25 years ago, a group inside Amazon released a tool called Web Lab, and you see lab A/B, like A/B testing, that allows any developer at Amazon to pick up a couple of features and deploy their feature. So it's a runtime library in self-service mode, and it's a backend service that any developer, any team at Amazon can use. And we are using that system extensively across Amazon, Audible, Twitch, AWS. Web Lab, right now there is roughly 60,000 people registered to the Slack channel of interest for Web Lab. So we can estimate that there is 50 to 60,000 developers using Web Lab at Amazon. And we learn a lot by building that tool, assembling that tool, providing it to a large population of developers for a wide variety of use cases. And the service we built at AWS to provide you equivalent feature have been influenced by these 25 years of experience, the return that we receive from internal development and internal usage of A/B testing at Amazon. So how can we implement a feature flag? If I want to be very naive and very simple, I would say if, then else. Basically, on one side, you have the version without the feature flag. On the other side, you have the version with the feature being activated. In the context of a web page, we use TypeScript to code the feature flag. So basically, I'm making a call, is feature activated for one specific user, the entity ID, for one specific feature, because you might have multiple features inside your application that you're testing at the same time. And depending on the result of this call, depending on the result of this API call, either you activate the DOM, the section of the HTML, either you hide it. Pretty basic. So that function, it's called the decision point. If you read about the theory of feature flag, this is where you take the decision. And where are you going to take the decision? There are really, really many different ways to do that. It depends on what you want to do. Do you want to run an experiment for a long period of time? Or are you actually currently deploying a new feature and you want a safe way to deploy your feature into production? So we can have, or I have this mental model of my feature flag, it's more like a configuration of my application. I see that as a configuration, and it's a dynamic configuration that I can change on the server, and the client will download the configuration and then read, parse a JSON file, a YAML file, and decide what to show to end user based on the configuration. Or you can have a different model saying, okay, I'm going to make an API call. At every moment I need to show that page, I'll call an API on the server side saying, hey, what is the current status? Should I show to that user or not show it to the user? And both have pro and con. I start this talk telling you that there is no, life is a balance. We need to make a decision. So configuration, it's quite simple to code. As a developer, I receive a configuration. I just parse a JSON object. Everybody, all developers can do that. And once the configuration file is there in my application, it's extremely low latency. If the user comes back on the page, the configuration is already there, so I can just read the configuration file again. I don't need to make an API call every time. So low latency and simplicity. But of course, if you update the configuration on the server side, your client side needs to realize that, hey, the configuration has changed on the server side, so you need to re-download, to recache it, so there is a bit extra complexity there. On the other side, API call, you have extreme flexibility, because every time you need to show how high the feature, you make an API call, but you pay for that API call. There is an extra latency. You need to open a TLS connection to a server. You have the latency of the round trip to the server. So if your web page, if your client application is super sensitive to the last millisecond of latency, you will pay the price for that. And you have to think about resiliency as well. What if the server does not answer? I know that we design things on AWS to be always available for you, but you know what Werner Vogels is saying, is that everything fails all the time. So you, as a developer, you have to think about what if the API does not return, or return extremely late, like there is like a extra latency, 300 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds. So you have to code fallbacks, default value, something sensible to not show to your customer a Java stack trace, for example. Say, oops, sorry, something went wrong. So it's a bit of extra complexity on the latency side. At AWS, we have a long history of providing multiple ways to do the same thing. Maybe you saw that blog post not from someone from AWS that described the 17 different ways to deploy a container on AWS. And for feature flag, we are not so different. There are multiple ways, but only 2. So that's the good news. One way, it's using AWS AppConfig. So AppConfig has been really designed to safely distribute, deploy configuration for your application. And at the beginning, it was like more traditional application running on a virtual machine, but now you can use AppConfig as well to distribute configuration to serverless AWS Lambda functions or to web application. Oliver will show you how to do that during the demo. On the other side, you have a relatively new service called Amazon CloudWatch Evidently. It has been introduced last year at reInvent, so it's a one-year-old service, which fits more on the API side, on the server-side type of service. So if you want to release a new feature to your user population in a very safe and controlled way, AppConfig is certainly the way to go, because it will progressively distribute the configuration file to your customer. It can roll back automatically. We are going to show you that during the demo as well. So if something goes wrong during the deployment, AppConfig can go back to the previous version automatically. Evidently, it's a bit different. Evidently, it's just one API that you need to call from your client application. Every time you want to show the web page in our demo, we will call this API to say, hey, should I show it or should I not show it to that specific user? And you can also deploy the feature progressively to a wide range of your customers. So if you want to experiment, test new ideas, experiment new feature for a long period of time, like exposing a feature for 10% of your customer population for the next 3 months, then Evidently is probably a better use case, a better service to fit that use case. So I know it might be a bit abstract and theoretical what I'm saying now, but I hope it will be much more clear when you will see it in the console and the way the two services are behaving. And of course, life is made of compromise, it's a balance. So since a couple of months, we can mix both worlds. So we released a few months ago, something called Evidently client-side evaluation. So your application can use Evidently API, but behind the scene, Evidently is calling AppConfig to download the configuration and to cache the configuration. But all the complexity complexity, it's 5 lines of code, but all the complexity of downloading the configuration, caching it, and refreshing it when the configuration change on the server side is managed by Evidently client-side evaluation. So you do not need to code that. And we released this for Lambda function at first. Right now it's only for Lambda. It's packaged as a Lambda layer. So you just attach the layer to your Lambda function, and you don't need to think about downloading the configuration and refreshing the configuration. Okay, that's pretty much it for me. I told you 30% of the time. We are just at the 30% marker. Now, demo time with this guy.
Demo. Can we have the demo screen, please? Hello, can we have the... Okay, thank you. Okay, so demo time. I'm going to reuse the application Seb created with a few twists, and we'll see how to release the new feature. So I have this application. I have 2 messages, and right now, let's say it's a real application, and if you want to add a new message, you have to send an email to someone in your company, so they manually add the message. But we want to add this feature that people can add messages directly from the user interface. So because it's a very simple demo, and for the sake of the demo, you see this user 42 here. So that's a random user that I create on the front end that is going to simulate that I am logging out and logging in with a new user. So every time I refresh, you see that I have a new random user. So I don't have to log out and log in again with a different user for you to see that the feature is activated or not. So this is the application. So we're going to show you how to use the 2 services, as I mentioned. So CloudWatch Evidently and AppConfig. So I'm going to start with Evidently. So this is the AWS console, so you may be familiar with. And I'm going to go to Evidently. So here in CloudWatch Evidently, I'm going to be able to create a project. And you have a very nice workflow here. It tells you, you create a project, you add a feature, you create a launch, and then you can monitor and analyze your application. So very easy. Create project, add feature, create launch. I'm just going to follow that. So I'm going to create a project, reinvent 2022. You need to select how you want to store your logs. So you can decide to store them in an S3 bucket. So you have to give the URI of the S3 buckets. Here for the demo, I'm going to use CloudWatch logs. So I need a log group. So you can either choose like a log group that exists already, or you can directly create a new one for your current projects. So let's create a new one here. And that's what Sam mentioned. You can activate client-side evaluation. And if I do that, it will ask me for the AppConfig configuration because it is using AppConfig in the background. So I'm not going to use that for the demo here. We'll go to AppConfig later to see how to release new feature. So let's create a project. And if you remember, so I created a project. Next step is to add a feature and then create a launch. So let's go in my project and let's create a feature. So I'm going to add a feature, which I'm going to call add comment, because it's to add a new comment. And here I have feature variations. So these are the different values my feature can take. So you have different types. You have Booleans, long, double, string, because you may want to send to your client a string or a number. For example, if you want to have like 3 or 4 different types of tests in your application or features or value for the feature. So here, because it's just true or false, I want to either see or hide, show or hide the form. So I'm going to use a Boolean. And so the default one is to be the read-only. So by default, you can't add new comments. So this is the false value, and it's read-only, and this is going to be the default value. And I'm going to add a variation, which is called editable. And editable will be linked to true as a value, and this is not the default one, because by default, I want my users not to have access to the feature. And then it gives you like a sample code, which is very, very useful. You will see that we'll just have to copy-paste it at some point. And you can see how to call the API. You can see it in JavaScript, Java, Python, but it works in every language where there's the SDK for AWS. And you can see when it returns to you, so you have this object with a value.bool value, and here you have either false or true, depending on if the feature is activated for this user or not. OK, so let's create the feature now. And if you remember, well, after I create a feature, I have to create a launch. So I'm going to create a launch. I'm going to call it add command launch. I'm going to select the feature. So you can directly create a feature from here. So this is the same form I just used. But I'm going to select the feature I just created, so add command. So you have the source code again here. And this is the launch configuration. So this is how you decide how your feature is going to be accessible to your users. So I'm going to say, for example, here that I want 60% of the traffic of my users to not have access to the feature yet. I want to be cautious. And then I'm going to say that 40% of the users have access to the feature. You can specify metrics. You can associate like a CloudWatch alarm if you want to have alarm raised when there's something wrong. But let's create this launch now. What is it? 40%. OK, so I created a launch. So now what I have to do, I have to connect my application to Evidently. But in order to do that, I need to give access to Evidently to my application. And for that, I'm going to create a Cognito service pool. So I'm going to go, oh, that's a lot of green. Green is good. So I'm going to open my console again. I'm going to Cognito. So Cognito is an identity management service on AWS. And I'm going to create an identity pool. OK, let's create a pool. I'm going to call it reinvent in Event 2022. And I want to authorize an authenticated user to use it, because it's like, it's like when you are doing some, getting metrics for your application. I want the application itself to call the service, not a certain user. So I'm going to activate unauthenticated entities, and I'm going to allow a basic flow here. I'm just creating the pool. And when you create a Cognito pool, it will automatically create IAM roles for you. So I'm going to keep this page open because I'm going to need the identity pool ID at some point. But now let's go in IAM. So IAM is the user identity and access management tool service on AWS. And now if I go to roles, you will see that I have 2 roles that have been created automatically for me by Cognito. And the one I'm interested in is the unauthenticated role. So I have policies here There's two policies that have been created by default, which I don't need, so I'm just going to remove them. And I'm going to add a new permission. So the service I want to give access to is Evidently. The action I want to do is to evaluate features. So I only want to give access to my application to evaluate a feature on CloudWatch Evidently. And then I'm going to specify the resource. So to get the resource, I'm going to go to my project here in configuration, and I'm going to copy-paste the on here. So just to say that only this feature, this project, and this account have access to Evidently. Okay, that's best practice, FYI. Okay, so now this is done. So now I have to go to my application. Everything I had to do in the console is now done. So let's go to my code. So the code is very, very simple. So it's just an HTML. We have the two messages we had earlier. Here I have a function called getEntityID, which is the one which is generated this random user ID you saw at the top. And then I have this code. So this code is calling a Evidently evaluate feature here. And I give it the entity ID. The entity ID is basically the user ID, which is simulatedly logged in on my application. So let's go see what this evaluate feature method does. So it's here. For now, it's pretty basic. I have to log in with a Cognito here. So I'm going to need the identity pool ID. So I mentioned earlier that I'm going to need that. So I'm going to copy-paste the identity pool ID, and I'm going to need the Cognito unauthenticated role here. I'm going to copy the on here and paste it here. So this method, AWS credential for anonymous user, it's here in another file. You're the Cognito expert. I don't know if you want to give a few words about what it's doing.
Yeah, it's a web application, and that web application is going to call an AWS API on the server side. And as you are a seasoned developer with AWS, you know that almost all our API calls have to be authenticated. So you need to have an access key and a secret key to authenticate yourself when you call the API. How do you do that in a web application? You cannot hard code an access key and secret key in your JavaScript because everybody will see it in their browser if they look at the source code.
Well, you could, but you shouldn't.
Yeah, don't do that. The way to do that properly is to use Cognito Identity Pool. So Cognito Identity Pool is a service I really like that allows you to trade a token, an identity token that you receive from an authentication service like login with Amazon, login with Google, sign in with Apple, login with Facebook. So these services are giving you a token, and Cognito Identity Pool is able to exchange a valid identity token for a pair of access key, secret key. And that pair of access key, secret key will be limited in time, 15 minutes by default, and limited to whatever permission you define in the role associated with that identity pool in the console. So it's extremely limited. It can do that with any OpenID token or Samuel token, so it can work also with Active Directory and other Samuel-compliant types of identity system. But here we don't have authentication for our user. We don't have a login page. It's a public page. Everybody has access. And that's why in Cognito Identity Pools, you saw that allow anonymous access. And with anonymous access, there is one API, an unauthenticated API, one of the few, I think there are two only on AWS, that you can use without an access key, secret key to say, hey, can I get a temporary access key, secret key from Cognito Identity Pool for an anonymous user? And again, that access key, secret key will be limited in time and limited in scope only to the permission that Oliver defined on IAM. So the only thing someone that has that access key, secret key can do is call the evaluate feature on API, on Evidently, that's the API it can call, only on that specific project, that specific resource, and that specific feature that we mentioned in the IAM policy. And if you know that, if you understand that, then you follow the doc, and there is one API to call on Cognito, and you try that with Evidently, and then it doesn't work. You still receive access is denied. And then you start to scratch your head, and you cannot see it. I have a hat, but I have white hair, partially because of that. Cognito Identity is scoping down the permission for anonymous user, for unauthenticated user. So it doesn't work with the 200 plus AWS service. It's only working with S3, DynamoDB, CloudWatch logs, and a few like that. Evidently, it's not part of that. So that code, what it does, it used the old way. It used Cognito identity to get an ID for my anonymous user. That's the line 31. Can you make it a bit bigger on the screen? That's the line, sorry, not 31, 32. I'm calling getID command, getID, that's the API on Cognito, to get a unique user ID from Cognito to represent my current user. And then I use an unauthenticated API, the second one, called getOpenID_token. So it generates an anonymous OpenID token. And then I switch to another service on line 37. And the API is called assume role with web identity. That's an API provided by a service called Secure Token Service, STS. It's one of the oldest AWS services, as old as IAM. So the goal of STS, as the name implies, is to distribute access key, secret key. So it will assume the unauthenticated role from Cognito that Oliver defined and return me an access key and a secret key. And this one is not scoped on like the one distributed by Cognito. This one, you can do pretty much whatever you want as long as you define the correct permission in the IAM role. And the last lines of that function just maps one data format to the other. So it returns an access key, a secret key, a session token, and an expiration date, which is by default 15 minutes, but you can control that. I saw a couple of you that are taking a picture of the code. Thank you. I will share with you a GitHub URL where you can see the application in action, and you can download and inspect the source code at your will after.
Yeah, if you were lost in the last 2 minutes, you can either just watch the replay slowly or just copy-paste the code and it works.
So that's why we have like 20 lines of code there. It's because the default implementation from Cognito for anonymous access key, secret key is not working with Evidently and not working with AppConfig. It's scoped down to a very specific list of services. And it's documented. After weeks, I found a page in the documentation that lists the exact services that are supported by Cognito Identity Pool.
Cool. Thanks for the explanation of how Cognito works. OK, so now that I have my Cognito connected to my application, I'm going to go back to Evidently here. And if you remember in the feature, when I was in the feature, I had this piece of code that was given to me here. So I'm just going to copy-paste this code here. And I'm going to put it in my application. So in my application, I have this Cognito thing. And I have this, I'm creating this Evidently object. And then I'm going to just paste the code I just saw here. And basically, I have this object where I have the entity ID. So the entity ID, if you remember, I put it as a parameter. So it's just the entity ID. And the feature is @comment, and the project is re:Invent 2022. And here, I then call the evaluate feature method. So here, I'm going to send a promise at the return of the function. So I'm just going to return the call of the function. OK, and this should work out of the box. So let's see if the demo works now. So I'm going back to my application. So let's inspect the project here. You can see that it already reloaded the page. So now you can see the form for the @comment. You can see that there is a call to the server here in the network. Go here. The @comment, I put the entity ID, and then I receive this value.bool value that we saw earlier. And it's here. So the flag is off for this 14 user, 45 it's on, 26 it's off, 60 it's on, 73 it's on, off. And if you do that long enough, you will see that it's like 60% of the people don't have access to the feature, and 40% have access to it. And because it's, we still have the entity ID sent, so the user ID, every time the user 98 is going to be calling the API, it will remember that the first time it called the API, the feature was on. So the next time for this user is going to be on again. So yeah, this is how you can choose how you want your user to have access to your feature. But now you may want to say, OK, this is good, 60%, 40% works for me, but I want that to increase that number. So I'm going back to my launch here. I'm going to edit it. So you can either edit the launch or modify the launch traffic. So let's edit the launch here. And I'm going back to this launch configuration. So remember, I put the modified traffic here, but you can select the schedule launch. And here I can say, OK, let's say today at 6 p.m., I want to have 60%, 40%. But let's say, like, I don't know, tomorrow, I want to increase that at midnight, and I want to go to 50%, because I want to increase the number of users who have access to the feature. And then I'm pretty confident, so I say, OK, let's say next week at midnight, I want the majority of my users, like 80%, to have access to, or 80%, to have access to the feature. And I just edit the launch, and then you will have this incremental evolution of the percentage of users who have access to a feature. And it takes a few seconds to edit here, but then you have this resume of what you have been editing just now. So you can see that this is launch history, this is the scheduled step that we just created, and you see that these are upcoming, and this is the one we have now that we just released. So something else you may want to do is that you may have like a small set of users, like some insiders user, who are very good at giving feedback, and you want them to be able to test the feature in advance. So this set of users, not random users. So if I go back to my launch here, where's the launch? I keep getting lost. No, I go to the feature here, and you see this is how the feature is evaluated. So we have different steps. We have first, we evaluate if there's overrides. We'll see in a minute what it is. Then we have the launches, which we just did. So if there is no override, we go with the, OK, random 60, 40%. And then you can also have experiments. Experiments is, I won't go into detail, but it's to do A/B testing. So you can have different users to have different access to different features. And then you have a lot of metrics, a lot of dashboards. And then you can take actions and decide which feature you want to launch, depending on how the users have been, the features have been performing for the users. So here, let's use the override method. You can see how you can give access to some users. So I'm going to add a list here, and I'm going to add an override. And I want to say the entity ID. So the entity ID in my case is a user ID, but it could be like a group ID, a customer group, whatever. Here's the user ID. I want to say that Olivier never has access to the feature. Olivier, I want always to be read-only. And I want to say that Seb, I want to activate the feature for Seb. So I want Seb to always have access to the feature. So let's edit the feature now. Now, if I go back to my application, so here we have the random user. But for the sake of the application, because I don't have access to the login and logout, I kind of lied to you earlier about this getEntityID function. So by default, it's doing this random user creation, unless there is an entity ID as a query parameter of the URL. So that's how I'm going to simulate that it's either Sebastian or me who is logged in. So here, I'm just going to put the entity ID Seb here. And so if I put Seb, you see that so it's Seb who is logged in, written here. And Seb, I can refresh as many times as I want. Seb will always have access to the feature. And he's going to give me a lot of good feedback. But then if I put Olivier instead, so now Olivier is connected, is logged in. And I can refresh as many times as I want. Olivier will never have access to the feature. So you can say that a set of users, a group of users, will have access to the feature before it's going randomly to the other users. So one thing with Evidently I want to show you, I'm going to go back to another project I did this morning. When you go to a launch, you have some data about the launch. So just to show you that you can monitor your launch. And you can see at every time how many users had access to the read-only or editable feature. So this is a demo that I created this morning around 11 a.m. and I've been playing with it. So there is some data, and you can see how your feature is going to be used by users. And it's roughly 60, 40% here for the number of people who have access to the feature or not access to the feature. All right, that was for Evidently.
And now, if I want to deploy a feature with AppConfig, what is different?
So now I'm pretty confident with my features, so I'm going to go to AppConfig. So let's say I go back to my application. All I did with the Evidently, it's not here. I'm going to comment that. I'm going to go with AppConfig.
Wait, so, you comment out the getEntityID. Ah, yes, getEntityID is not necessary.
So it's pretty much the same. I'm going to call a getFeature method, which is going to tell me if the feature is activated or not. And if it's activated, I'm going to display the form. So pretty much the same we had here, but we're going to call a method which is calling AppConfig in the background. So let's go back to the console. AppConfig, I'm going to create a new project, which I'm going to call, are you following? Reinvent 2022. I'm going to create the application, and now I have to create a configuration profile, because with AppConfig, you can do a lot of things. AppConfig feature flag is one of them, so I want to create a profile for feature flag. I'm going to call it Reinvent 2022. And then I'm going to create a flag. So flag is like what we had with the feature before. So I'm going to create a flag called @comment. Okay. Oh yeah, I'm going to say that it's a short-term flag. So this one is just a tag we put on the project, on the flag actually, to say that it's a short-term flag. So it means that this feature is going to be released quite soon and entirely. So I can then filter my project and then remove the code in my project associated with the short-term flag. So this is just a tag on the flag. Okay, I have my flag here created. I'm going to save a new version. And then I'm going to start a deployment. So let's start a deployment. To create a deployment, I'm going to need an environment. So I don't have any environment yet. So I'm going to create one. I'm going to call it dev. You can monitor environment. You can do a lot of things. I don't have time to go into detail with everything. But let's just create an environment called dev. Then I have the configuration version. So this is the first one I just created, the first version. So I only have this one. And then I have to decide which deployment strategy I want to use. So by default, we have 3. We give it to you. But you can create your own strategy. So let's create a new one here. You give it a new name. So immediate, I'm going to call it immediate deploy. You select the deployment type. So it can be linear or exponential. You say for every step of the deployment, how many % of the user you want to add to have access to the feature. So here we're just going to leave 20%. And then you have the deployment time. The deployment time is how long it's going to take to deploy your application. So if you put 10 minutes, then it will be cut, and every few minutes you will have 20% of the users who have access to the feature. Here I want to deploy my application right now because I don't have time. We don't have 3 hours for the demo, so I want to deploy immediately. And then you have the bake time. So the bake time is the amount of time you have to wait before completing the deployment. And during this bake time, you can monitor your application. You can roll back your application until the bake time is over. Here again, I don't want to monitor my application. I don't even have the feature flag, the flag activated. So I'm just going to create this strategy and start the deployment. So now, as we did before, I need my application to have access to AppConfig. So I'm going to go back to my role here. And so I already had the policy to have access to Evidently. I'm going to add the one to have access to AppConfig so my application can have access to it. So the service is AppConfig. So the action, there's a lot of actions in AppConfig because it does a lot of things. So which actions do I need? If I go back to my code, so I'm going to go to see this feature, this function, this get feature function. So if I go to AppConfig here, it's here. No, it's here. It's calling another function called get configuration config, get field config. And so what it does here, few things. We need the credential for the Cognito. So I'm just going to copy paste the 2 here because it's the same Cognito pool and it's the same role. And then what I do, I create this AppConfig data object. So just an object that you can have when you import from the AWS SDK. Oops. And then this function, what it does, it calls 2 functions on the API. The start configuration session, so we start a sessions, connection with the AppConfig, and then we get the latest configuration. So this is the 2 methods I called to AppConfig. So this is the 2 functions I want to activate. So start configuration and get latest configuration. So we have start configuration sessions and get latest configuration. Okay, you could activate everything, but it's a good practice to only activate what you actually need in your application. And same for the resource, you could activate all the resources, but let's only activate it for the project I just created. So this is the region. I'm gonna get the application ID here. This is the application I just created. I'm going to get the environment ID. So this is the dev environment. So you saw that I created the environment directly in the create launch interface. But you can create new environment here if you want to. So I'm going to get the ID. And the configuration profile, let's just activate it for every configuration profile. And now I'm going to review my policy, save changes. And now I have done everything I need to do on the console. So let's go back to my code here. So nothing to do here. I just have access to give access to Cognito. But if I go back to my code, so before calling this getFeature method, I need a few information. I'm going to need the application. It's called reInvent 2022. The config environment dev. I need the configuration ID. Let's go to my here configuration. Let's get the ID of the configuration. And I'm going to need the flag name, which is add comment. OK, and now if I did everything correctly, my application should also be working. Ooh, and it's not working. 2022, thank you. It's better. So now it returns false because my feature is not activated yet. So I can refresh, it's always returning false. So now I go back to my application here. So I'm going to go to my flag, and I'm going to activate it. So I activate my flag. I'm going to save a new version, so I'm going to have a version 2, and I'm going to start a new deployment. So I keep the same environment. I'm going to choose a strategy, so I can keep the same one, but for the demo, I'm going to use one that exists already that we proposed to you, which is called all at once. So it's going to deploy the application immediately, so there is like a deployment time of 0 minutes, but I have a bake time of 10 minutes. So I'm going to be able to monitor my application until the bake time is over. So let's choose this strategy this time. I'm going to start a deployment. And then my application now, if I go back to my application, my web application, and I refresh, I get true. So my application, my feature has been deployed immediately for 100% of my users because I just put 0 minutes.
It's because it's a demo.
Because it's a demo, and I only have 10 minutes left, and I don't have time to show you how it works for days or minutes. So now I have my feature activated. But if I see that there's any issue with it, until the bake time is over, I can still roll back my deployment. So I just have to click there. And now I'm back to the previous version of my application. So if I refresh here, we see that now it returns false. So my feature is back to the state it was during the previous version of it.
And you can link that to a CloudWatch alarm. So if you have metrics and alarms put on your technical or business metrics, and the alarm raise, the fact that the alarm is on can automatically trigger the rollback of your deployment as well.
Yes, we don't have time to go in monitoring, but yeah, it's very important to monitor your deployment and your features. So yeah, that was it for the demo for Evidently and Feature Flag. And you see that in just like half an hour, we managed to create a flag, create a feature, activate it using 2 services. You just have to choose one. So it's very easy to implement and to configure in the console. Done for the demo. Can we go back to the slides, please?
So if you want to safely deploy a new version, roll out a configuration into production safely, and I insist on the safely with the automatic rollback, AppConfig is the way to do. If you want to experiment on a long period of time, a couple of different variations of the same feature, or maybe run A/B test. We didn't went into the A/B test part of Evidently, but then Evidently is probably the service you want to use. So you see it's similar functionalities, but slightly different use cases. In any case, whatever service you use or you choose to deploy your new feature, you have to think about a few extra steps. First, life is made of compromise. You never get anything for free. You have to make a balance and decision. Feature flag comes with extra latency. Even if you have to download a config file and look up at the config file, it will be a lower latency than if you are making one API call for each evaluation, but you will still have an extra latency. And for some application, it's okay. For some application, it might be a problem as well. So there is a couple of ways to decrease that latency. Try to use backend services in an AWS region close to your customer. Here we were using US East 1, if I look correctly at your demo. So for every single API call, we cross a country and back, which is, it was okay. In this case, the network here is good enough to have like almost real-time decision there. But for some application, it might not work. So it really depends on your use case. Have a look at what is required, what are the requirements for your use case. Think about testing, unit testing. You need to mock the service, the feature flag service as well, evidently, or AppConfig. That's extra code for you to manage. That's extra use cases. You want to test the fact that the feature is on, the feature is off. It's a web application or demo. Unit testing doesn't really apply for that, but you can use the same technique, feature flag, for any type of application, server-side, Lambda function, AIML, big data type of application. And by the way, we didn't say it, but everything that we show in TypeScript, JavaScript today is also available from all our SDK, Python, Java, Rust, Swift, whatever SDK you're using. So it will give you an extra cost on testing, extra cost in terms of complexity and the time you need to write the code. And same for runtime. If you have hundreds of features in parallel, hundreds of experiments in parallel, how can you reproduce one specific customer experience? If something is going bad for one customer, how are you going to trace a specific call across all your if-then-else to see exactly the subset of feature that that customer saw and the feature that were not available to that customer? So observability will be a bit more complicated as well. That's something you have to think about when you decide to use feature flag. And then what are you going to do when the feature is 100% deployed with AppConfig or dial-up with Evidently? You need to clean your code after that, because otherwise you are going to accumulate a depth of if-then-else in your code, and extra calls, API calls that are not necessary anymore. So how do you do that? You need to plan for time in your sprint, each sprint, to clean up the feature that have been 100% deployed in the previous sprint. That's something you need to proactively think about in terms of project management and time. At Amazon, we love things that are automatic, so that we don't forget something. We call that mechanism. And the mechanism we are using at Amazon is to automatically open a ticket in our ticketing system when a feature is 100% deployed. Remember, everything on AWS has an API, so you can use EventBridge, for example, to detect that Evidently has been dialed up for that specific feature at 100% and send a message to something that will cut a ticket in Jira or whatever ticketing system you're using. So that automatically, once a feature is deployed, the team knows that there is an extra step to do, like cleaning up your code during the next sprint. I promise you the code sample. It's on my GitHub. The URL is not super visible on this slide. It's github.com/sebsto, S-E-B-S-T-O. It's the three first letters of my first name and last name, Sebsto, S-E-B-S-T-O. And you go to the Evidently demo, and you get the application there. So this application, as I said at the beginning, we try to keep it as small and simple as we can to remove anything fancy on the user interface side. We decide to write it with AWS SDK for JavaScript version 3, because if you look at all documentation, Stack Overflow, and if you search Google, you will find tons of examples with the SDK version 2, and version 2 and version 3 is a bit different, so we decide, no, it's 2022, it's time to make example with JavaScript version 3, so that's also a good starting point if you never use JavaScript SDK version 3. It's written in TypeScript because we prefer TypeScript over JavaScript, and there is no fancy library, there is no jQuery, there is no
framework.
Nothing. It's pure, plain, boring JavaScript HTML application. That's it for us. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to leave us a feedback in the AWS event application. Give us 5 stars. More seriously, leave us comment about how we can make these tools more useful for you. More demo, more code, less code, more code, different type of code. I'm not going to take any live question now, but we will be available just right outside for the next half an hour. So feel free to come and to ask your questions. Thank you very much.